Hello once more. For the beginning, I will shake the planet a little bit. Those images of southern hemisphere were captured by MTSat-2 satellite. Some of you should notice already that not everything is alright here. And I don't mean the ring patterns which I was discussing couple months ago and which can be connected with the geomagnetic pulsations. Much more spectacular process can be seen mostly during the night time. If you still don't know what I'm talking about, look at this red spot. It seems that the planet is shaking. During the daytime there are some shakes as well, but they are much less visible. Of course, my first thought was that it is the satellite which is shaking, not Earth, or that it is some kind of error in the software. But there is a small problem. Those pictures were made by a different satellite, MTSat, without the number 2. And shakes can be seen here clearly as well. Some pretty strange disturbances can be seen as well closer to the South Pole. And while we're looking at this part of the globe, I couldn't miss the opportunity to show you a nice example of atmospheric flux tube. Okay, time for some graphs. This time I would like to discuss some very unusual behavior of geomagnetic field. Just after midnight on January 13, Canadian magnetometer station, coded as SNK, how the hell should I spell Sanikiluwak, recorded sudden and unexplained drop of geomagnetic field magnitude. It seems that I saved this plot right in time, as soon after someone noticed at last what is going on and censored the data. And they expect us to believe in their good intentions. Anyway, first thing which I've made was to check the values of magnetic field. This data is from January 12, day before the drop. Look at the numbers on the right side. This is the censored graph from next day, and this one is from January 14. There is almost no difference between the readings from 12 and 14 January. But during the time in between, magnitude of geomagnetic field was around 700 nanoteslas weaker. Not exactly weaker. Total magnitude bottom graph didn't change that much after the drop. Because Y magnetic component is negative, the lower the value gets, the stronger is the field. Of course, like always, I've checked different monitors on ISWA to see if there is something what could be the cause of the magnitude drop. I think that the most possible explanation can be seen on A's magnetic field graph, where we can see a clear shift of IMF orientation, almost at the same time. BX and BY components, black and blue lines, became suddenly positive, but BZ, red line, was not affected. This shift was probably the cause of another discharge of current rings. But in the difference to the strange magnitude drop, those events are rather common, so I still don't know the actual cause of this event. I've had to compare a lot of data from current ring monitors and look for all possible differences between latest particle discharges, but it was worth it. I think that now I'm ready to make my first step on the way to explain some events from January 13. There is one visible difference between the ring discharge from this day and other discharges which are pretty common on those monitors. Lack of energetic particles which supposed to circulate around our planet makes it much easier for the low energy field to push one of its field lines straight to the surface. Magnetic influence on our environment can be seen nicely at lowest energy bands. This monitor shows protons at 1,7 kV. Most important is the fact that most of the time when this reconnection takes place, the size of negative flux tube is quickly reduced by incoming particles. Plasma pressure makes it much thinner than in the beginning. I was partially explaining this process in one of my latest movies. But let's get to the point. As I said, this is how it looks most of the time, when ring discharge takes place. This one was recorded on January 15. 2 days earlier, it wasn't so obvious. In the evening, January 12, flux tube was still thin as a needle. Then, at 23:20 UTC, as always during those discharges, monitors were switched off. Next frame was generated almost 2 hours later, and the particles were gone. Flux tube, which is supposed to be bigger soon after reconnection, seems to be only a bit wider than before the discharge. But instead shrinking even more, breach in the magnetosphere starts to get bigger. Even the incoming protons didn't manage to squeeze it. In the beginning of afternoon, things seem to go in good direction. Flux tube is shrinking. But suddenly, soon after a second wave of particles appeared on the night side, bang! We have a second discharge. This one allowed a connection with 2 different field lines. But not for long. As soon after we can see another discharge. 3 times in a single day. I would call it a hat trick. Just as before, flux tubes are thinned during the connection and are growing larger. Finally, in the afternoon January 14, things started to calm down, and an incoming wave of protons managed to patch the giant hole, which almost for 2 days left us partially without the defense against cosmic radiation. Without the particles which should absorb or deflect part of the energy which is produced by the sun, our planet starts to suffer because of increased amount of ionizing radiation. There are two main factors which cause neutral particles in the upper atmosphere to become energetic ions: UV light and solar wind. Second factor depends mostly on solar activity, at least according to official space weather models. However, it affects as well the ionosphere, which is our defense against ultraviolet radiation. There are a couple other factors, like X-rays, gamma-ray bursts, or cosmic rays, but I won't speak about them today. Anyway, not so long ago I found a nice scientific publication in which we can learn that there is a possible connection between geomagnetic field and mass extinction events from the past. Scientists which made this research figured out that during the time when geomagnetic field is extremely weak, density of oxygen, which allows Earth to sustain life, in the atmosphere becomes too low for bigger and more complicated life forms. Oxygen is very energetic in its atomic form. Its electric charge is strong enough to overcome the gravity and leave our planet as a plasma bubble. Like this one. Or this. Or this one. Just like this one. Or like the giant one at the end of animation. Oxygen stays in the molecular form O2 only at lowest altitudes. At higher levels the UV radiation is much stronger. Neutral molecules gain additional energy and break into single atoms. In this state, oxygen is capable to flow out from the ionosphere. Because of the discharged current rings, the UV radiation is increased and more neutral particles is turned into ions. And this brings us back to the mass extinction threat. Look what happened with the density of neutral oxygen molecules at 450 kilometers during January 13. More than 50% of oxygen disappeared. Conclusion was pretty obvious. Neutral oxygen started to disappear when increased cosmic radiation caused more molecules to break into single atoms at high altitude. So, during the time when O2 started to disappear, we can expect that the density of atomic oxygen will grow. But probably you won't notice anything from the first sight. At this time I started to doubt in my explanation. I had to watch it couple times more to notice that the density started indeed to grow. Only this time it was the lower value, blue color, which was affected by the increased ionization, while before it was the value on top of the bar which changed much more. On the night side, density of atomic oxygen grew around 3 times so much in less than 48 hours. Bigger problem is that almost 4 days later, when I'm recording this movie, things didn't change too much on those monitors. Lower logarithmic value is still 4 times bigger than before January 13. Neutral oxygen molecules remain seriously decreased during this time, and I can't see any signs suggesting any changes in the near future. Notice that soon after the decrease of particles amount started to gain strength, main concentration of oxygen molecules moved from the North Pole to the southern one. During last days, oxygen was changing its location each couple hours. But it wasn't connected with any serious changes of the concentration at high altitudes. Something in my gut tells me that those north-south shifts can be possibly connected with the tilts of geomagnetic dipole axis, which I explained couple weeks earlier. But this is not all. Neutral nitrogen molecules, which are the main component of the air we're breathing, started to disappear from the upper atmosphere just as oxygen did. However, the density didn't drop that much as we've seen on previous animation. At least when we talk about the percentage of nitrogen concentration in the atmosphere. But we need to keep in mind that there is 4 times so much nitrogen as oxygen in the air. So even if the density didn't drop by more than 25% of the initial content, amount of neutral molecules which were turned into ions is probably equal or even bigger than in the case of O2. Problem is that I didn't find any monitor on which we would see a clear increase of nitrogen ions at this time, and I have no idea what happened with the N2 molecules which were lost since the beginning of January 13. The only visible change of nitrogen atmosphere content can be seen on the O-N2 ratio monitor. To be honest, I'm not sure how to read this data, but the value at the bottom of scale in the lower right corner grew 3 times bigger than it was before 13/01/2015. I wouldn't call it a coincidence. As you probably know, nitrogen and oxygen are the main components of the air. Their density is connected directly with the thickness of atmosphere layer, which will shrink when we start to lose those particles. Of course, shrinking atmosphere is already a scientific fact. And it seems that the density of oxygen in upper atmosphere is still dropping. During the last couple hours, number of particles fell below the level which remained pretty stable since January 13. All we can do is to hope that the rate of loss will decrease, or at least won't grow higher. It seems that I've managed to describe the process which is responsible for disappearing atmosphere. But still, there is one small problem. I didn't manage to find any connections between the oxygen loss and the sudden drop of geomagnetic field in Canada. I'm not even sure if such connection exists at all. I can make a guess that the latest oxygen density drop is probably connected with another current ring discharge which took place in the morning of January 17. Just like most of previous discharges, it can be seen nicely on the SWMF plus RCM magnetopause position monitor. This one is quite brutal. It looks that the plug was pulled out together with the socket and a big part of wall. Magnetic reconnection caused a kind of plasma eruption, which made an enormous hole in the middle of bow shock. Look at this image. Magnetopause was ripped apart by the backside magnetic pull. Look what happened with the velocity vectors within the magnetotail. I'm still amused by those new magnetosphere monitors. Maybe NASA is not completely honest with us, but those signets are one of their greatest achievements. I promise to be more kind to you if you will keep them running just as you do now. But it's enough of the theory. Let's move to the practice. Till now I was talking mostly about the space environment, and most of you could have the feeling that things which are taking place thousands kilometers above our heads are virtual, invisible forces which rule in some distant dimension. But when we look at satellite images, illusion fades away. As I said last time, magnetic fields are invisible and immaterial, but they affect the physical matter in very visible way. Particles which were scattered randomly in space gain life and act in logical way. Plasma is not called plasma without a reason. Matter becomes flesh for the spiritual magnetic field. Although everything in the universe is trying to reach the balance, our planet is far from it. Circulation of energy on Earth is changing quickly, and the changes seem to increase rapidly. Those twin typhoons over Indian Ocean are something what we don't see every day. But I wanted to speak today about the rules of interactions between geomagnetic field and weather patterns. Those things are still treated as fantasy by the old-date scientists. But I don't care about it. I'm not a titled scientist, so I am not afraid to talk about things which I've simply guessed by myself. As you probably know, magnetosphere is made of two types of field lines. Closed ones, which are placed mostly at lower altitudes and connect both hemispheres of the planet, and open ones, which stick out from magnetic poles located still close to the geographic ones. Open field lines are connected to our planet only on one side. Second end is connected to the IMF. This allows the exchange of particles between Earth and space beyond. Most spectacular effect of this exchange is for sure the aurora, which appears on the sky during geomagnetic storms, when the field of planet is seriously disturbed. But I think that open field lines play another important role in shaping our environment. I think that they are responsible for the shape and placement of polar vortex, both of them. Magnetic connection can be recognized by couple characteristics. One of them is caused by the fact that all currents of particles which are guided by magnetic field lines are helical. Wherever we see a vortex, no matter if we are talking about plasma physics or weather, we can assume that we are dealing with electromagnetism. But to understand it, you need to look at this term from a wider perspective. There are not so many differences between electric current and a river. Air current is just another current with the same laws which describe the virtual electromagnetic fields. The only difference is the energy of particles which make the current. Our environment is made of particles at very low energy bands, which we learned to call as neutral. Anyway, in the case of our neutral atmosphere, water vapor is the blood circulating in the body and transporting other particles from one place to another. Although water doesn't have any electric charge, it is a very good conductor and solvent. Ionized particles mix with water vapor and clouds at highest layers start to behave like plasma. Big part of charged particles in atmosphere is being carried to the polar regions, where open magnetospheric field lines transfer the energy to the interplanetary magnetic field. Outflow of energy is causing the polar air masses to form multiple vortexes, which all together form a bigger vortex. Direction in which it rotates depends on the polarity of geomagnetic field. But while polar circulation over the southern hemisphere looks pretty normal, over the northern half things start to go wrong. Although at the first sight everything is okay, a closer look reveals us some serious disturbances of the air circulation. Entire polar vortex is spinning counterclockwise, just as it's supposed to. North Pole has negative polarity and causes the inward flow, just as low atmospheric pressure, which over northern hemisphere rotate in the same direction. Disturbances start to be obvious when we will concentrate on the smaller vortexes, which are powered by open magnetospheric field lines. Here we can see that air currents start to form parallel patterns on the east and west halves of hemisphere. This can mean only one thing. Air masses which were circulating around the north geographic pole started to split and form two different polar vortexes. There are two areas which cause this irrational behavior. If things will continue to go this way, we can assume that those are the most possible locations of the future north geomagnetic pole. Second kind of field lines, closed ones, is responsible for the circulation of different particles around the equator and at lower latitudes. Closed field lines, white color, are much stronger than open ones, violet color. They are responsible as well for the size and shape of plasma sphere, which includes the current ring and radiation belts. However, most important is the fact that closed geomagnetic field lines connect northern and southern hemispheres, what allows the energy to circulate within the environment of Earth. Without those connections, there wouldn't be no exchange of energetic particles between the geomagnetic poles. Most of you know probably that air masses spin in opposite directions over both hemispheres. Low pressure systems, which are placed north from the equator, rotate counterclockwise, while in the south their spin is directed clockwise. This simple law should be rather obvious to anyone who knows the basics of meteorology. But I'm wondering if some of you tried to find any explanation of this process. If you watched my movies before, you won't be surprised too much if I will tell you that the cause will be quite easy to guess when we realize that our environment, which appears to be based on solid matter, is actually powered by magical and invisible magnetic field. And in the case of magnetic forces, direction of spin depends completely on the polarity. Another primary law of electromagnetism tells that exchange of energy between opposite electric potentials can take place only when the directions of particle flows are the same. Of course, everyone knows that air masses move always from the high pressure systems towards the areas where the pressure is low. However, low and high pressure systems rotate in opposite directions when they're placed on the same hemisphere. Because the electric charge of atmospheric particles is rather low, part of them can be transferred between red and blue arrows, representing air masses with opposite pressure. But I think that you've noticed already that the connections between arrows placed next to each other seem to be very weak. This is the time to speak about the third law, which, just like previous ones, describes the universal rules in the magical realm of electromagnetic fields, duality or dipolarity of magnetic connections. I've explained this subject many times before, and I don't like to repeat myself too often. However, this time I can support my claims with a visual proof. All magnetic poles, no matter if they are described as positive or negative ones, are in fact made of opposite polarities, which are placed next to each other, just like on ionospheric convection monitors. If we want to tell what is the magnetic orientation in such pair of coupled opposites, we need simply to check what is the polarity which dominates in the relationship of opposite fields. For example, in the south, high pressure system is clearly bigger and stronger than the low pressure right next to it. High atmospheric pressure is causing an outward directed current. That's why I can tell that those two opposite polarities can be treated as a single pole with positive magnetic orientation. Of course, over the northern hemisphere, configuration of polarities is directly opposite. Now, there shouldn't be any problems to point out the closed field line which connected both hemispheres. However, the line which I've just made shows only a part of the whole process. Just as the main polarities are in fact dipolar, so the connection between them has to be dipolar as well. So, each time when we look at magnetic polarities with a field line which connects them, we have to remember that there has to be a force which is directed in opposite way. Only then electric current can take place. According to Mr. Hopkins, universe in which we live is a result of coincidence, or a combination of multiple accidents which took place in the past. I don't believe in such thing as coincidence. There is logic in the laws which describe the world which we know. Reality still exists, billions years after the bang which we treat as beginning of everything. Someone who wrote all those scripts in engine of the software which is responsible for generating the physical reality, someone who wrote all those scripts in engine of the software which is responsible for generating the physical reality, had to be a real genius with an artistic soul. Rules of universe are clear and easy to understand. They seem to lack any bugs and are resistant to all possible ingerences of conscious life forms. If we could travel in time back and forth, just like in the scientific model which tries to explain our reality, chance that there would be someone who would try to kill his own grandfather before he met his future wife, grandmother of the time-traveling assassin, only to see how the end of universe can look like, would be more than certain. Fact that we live and that the time didn't collapse before it even started to flow is for me a clear sign that our creator is much more reasonable than scientists who laugh when they hear the word creator. But let's go back to the weather and electromagnetic forces which shape the currents of our atmosphere. Till now I've tried to explain the magnetic influence on weather patterns which we are used to. However, those patterns are not common anymore. Our planet is going through the greatest change of recorded history. This shift is clearly affecting all aspects of our environment. Weather changes are even more dynamic than other anomalies. Those typhoon twins which appeared on the Indian Ocean are a nice example of air currents disturbances. Of course, connection between two low-pressure systems is rather uncommon, But it is not the main reason why I'm showing you this animation. Those images show a very important process which until now could be seen only on space weather monitors. Magnetic reconnection. Many of you asked me before how the disturbances which are visible on magnetosphere monitors can affect us directly. Why should we care about some invisible process which takes place far beyond the world as we know? Now I can give you an answer which is a surprise even for me. I never thought that we will be able to watch how electromagnetic force influences directly our physical environment. But once more, it turns out that real life is still full of surprises. Since those low pressure systems appeared over Indian Ocean, they didn't change their locations. But somewhere around the evening of January 16, bigger of the typhoon twins started to move to the southeast. Actually, it didn't move by itself, but was rather pulled by the southern polar vortex, which connected itself to the storm and ripped it apart couple hours later. From electromagnetic point of view, this process can be explained nicely as the effect of magnetic reconnection. Closed geomagnetic field line, which was powering the tropical storm, broke apart and connected itself to the open field line over the polar cap. Couple weeks ago, I've recorded and explained similar process using the SWMF plus RCM magnetosphere simulation. At this time, closed field lines appeared over the northern pole. If my explanation is correct, we should see the same situation between 16th and 17th January, only that this time reconnection should take place over the southern hemisphere. Let's go. And here is something what fits into the description. Bigger part of black open field lines turned red over the southern pole. Some of open field lines from the northern pole became closed as well at lower latitudes. But it is clear that southern hemisphere was affected stronger than the north one. But this is not all. And this is exactly the image which I expected to see here. I think that I don't need to explain anything about this disturbance, as it shows perfectly things about which I was talking minute or two earlier. The only field lines which remained open over the southern polar cap started to point northward. Of course, it's the first time when I've managed to connect magnetosphere simulation with weather patterns and air currents in the atmosphere. So I still need to research it further if I want to be certain about this claim. However, as I said not so long ago, I don't believe in coincidences. Before I will move further, I want to show you another example of magnetic reconnection in the atmosphere, which was taking place at the same time when the typhoon was connected to the polar cap. Like a giant harpoon, an electromagnetic tentacle, flux tube, emerged from the polar region and smashed into the air masses above southern Africa, what caused a visible effect on the cloud layer. Last thing on the EUMETSAT images which I want to show you is not exactly connected with our current subject. Look what is happening with the shape of Earth over southern hemisphere. Starting from 18 UTC till 3 UTC on the next day, we can clearly see that the contour of planet is shrinking. This process can be seen every day at similar time. I can make a small guess that if I would run this bird, we would see that exactly at the same time, the tilt of geomagnetic dipole is causing the strongest disturbances of magnetosphere. If I'm correct, it would mean that the magical magnetic field is causing an absolutely real wobble of physical geographic poles. It is the third satellite which shows the wobble of entire planet. Okay, now I would like to show you how the electromagnetic forces affect the weather on planetary scale. First, I will point out the strongest and biggest flux tubes which are connected to the atmosphere. Problem is that most of those connections circulate all the time around the planet, changing their shape and connection points. The only tube which appears to be stationary is marked with yellow arrow. Notice that the angles of field lines are different over southern hemisphere. Black lines show the tubes which are placed with 45 degrees, more or less, to the equator. White color shows the field lines which are rather perpendicular to it. Field lines which are perpendicular are something new for me, and they can be a sign that Earth changes move to another level. From all those electromagnetic tentacles, I was really freaked out by the one which hit the Southern Africa a couple days earlier and right now is passing over Australia. Flux tube grew a lot since it emerged from the polar cap and now its size is enormous. Notice that there is a second negative flux tube which appeared in the lower left corner. There is even a third tube which is placed between two main negative connections. In the difference to them, this one is placed at lower layer of atmosphere and it's barely visible in the infrared channel. Its existence starts to be obvious when images switch to the visible range. I think that this can be a positive field line. If you were freaked out by those pictures, you probably won't feel better when I tell you that all those field lines manage already to cause a lot of mess in the equatorial air circulation. Clouds which were placed in the north from Australia started to turn back and form a giant whirlpool. Field line in the bottom left corner seems to prevent the air masses from moving further to the west. This situation can turn out to be crucial for our planet. Before I will finish talking about our planet, I want to show you last thing. Not so long ago, I was showing you the chemical composition of our atmosphere. One of the most poisonous components was the particulate matter. Even a small dose of it can cause a serious damage of our health. And now look what happened over Europe beginning from January 9.
Sobotę, nie w niedzielę? Sobotę. Dobra.
Bo ja w piątek jadę do Michasia, w sobotę na piątek.
W sobotę na piątek?
Piątek na sobotę.
A giant cloud of particulate matter appeared southwest from Spain and started to cover Europe. After 1 week, density of particular matter 10 over half of the continent reached extremely high values. This is the last image based on actual satellite readings. And this is the forecast for the date January 20. I record this movie on January 21. I'll try to compare the simulation with actual data when it will be published, probably in next Vibes of Universe episode. It can be pretty funny. If we look at previous simulated forecasts and compare them with satellite readings, it will be obvious that they don't have nothing in common. For the end, let's look at the latest coronal hole stream impact, which took place in the morning of January 21. One day earlier, Earth was passing through the frontal density wave. However, most important is the fact that the incoming fast solar wind stream changed the orientation of IMF, which was positive for more than a week, against all possible simulations. According to the monitors of heliospheric polarity, we were passing through a negative IMF sector till January 18. LM-SOL simulation shows a sudden change of the orientation day later. But the readings from ACE satellite showed that in real life IMF remained positive through all this time. Hard to tell if it was the frontal density wave or IMF polarity flip what caused the compression and a drop of electron flux on GOES readings, but I can tell you that density spikes recorded by ACE have nothing to do with it. Compression of the plasmosphere can be seen on all magnetosphere monitors. It seems as well that current rings were again discharged couple hours before the arrival of coronal hole density wave. And again, the change of IMF polarity was connected with disturbances in the behavior of atomic oxygen. But I've noticed that density of those particles in the ionosphere started to drop couple hours before the change of solar wind polar angle. Right now, most of atomic oxygen is placed on the night side of planet. Good side of all those events is the fact that the amount of neutral oxygen molecules grew at the same time to the level from the beginning of this movie. Geomagnetic activity started to grow almost 24 hours after the arrival of coronal hole stream. On Kiruna magnetometer we can see a moderate disturbance which reached its maximum value around 18 UTC. But it doesn't make any sense, as the possible cause, strong negative BZ, was recorded more than an hour earlier. It seems that the number of atmospheric connections between equator and polar regions is growing over both hemispheres. Air masses over Australia are turning back just as I predicted. If you didn't fall asleep during this movie, maybe you will be able to connect those animations with the SWMF plus RCM magnetosphere simulation, which I will show you for the end. Class dismissed. Be safe. Peace.